Somewhere between the South China Sea and the Pearl River Delta, a cluster of islands and a narrow peninsula thrust themselves into one of the world's great natural harbors. The water is deep enough for the largest container ships on Earth, and it sits at the geographic hinge between the Pacific and the Indian Oceans, between East Asia and everything beyond it. From the peak of Hong Kong Island on a clear day, you can see the forest of skyscrapers on both sides of the harbor. The container terminals stacked 8 stories high with steel boxes holding the world's commerce, and beyond them, the green hills of the new territories, rolling north toward the border with mainland China. Everything about this place was shaped by that harbor. The name itself, Hongkong in Cantonese, translates as fragrant harbor, and the people who gave it that name had been reading the water here for longer than any colonial record bothered to acknowledge. Hong Kong has spent the last 2 centuries caught between empires, between histories, between the competing claims of nations whose interests in the place have rarely had much to do with the people actually living in it. What those people built anyway, under those pressures and in spite of them, is one of the most astonishing human achievements of the modern era. This is the story of Hong Kong. Long before any British naval vessel appeared on the horizon, the islands and inlets that make up modern Hong Kong were home to communities whose relationship with the water defined everything about how they lived. The Tanka people, boat dwellers, who called themselves Soi Sung Yan, meaning those born of the water, were among the earliest inhabitants of the coastal southern China region, living on sampans and junks grouped in floating colonies, fishing the channels and sheltering in the typhoon anchorages. The word Hong Kong was theirs, given to the harbor, and it survived everything that followed. By the 11th century, Punti clan settlers, Cantonese-speaking Han Chinese, descended from Song dynasty migrants, had established walled villages in the new territories, building an agricultural civilization in the fertile lowlands of what is now Yuen Long and Tai Po. The Hakka followed, arriving from more northerly provinces and farming the hillsides where the Punti had not settled. The Hoklo came from Fujian as fishermen. These 4 communities, Tanka, Punti, Hakka, Hoklo, had been living in complex, overlapping relationship with each other and with the land and water for centuries, by the time the British arrived and pronounced the whole place a barren rock with hardly a house upon it. The pronouncement revealed more about the pronouncer than the place. When the Union flag was raised over Possession Point on January 26, 1841, the population of Hong Kong Island alone was around 7,450 people. The sequence of events that produced the British colony of Hong Kong began not with any strategic calculation about the harbor, but with tea. By the early 19th century, the British addiction to Chinese tea had created a profound trade imbalance. Britain was buying far more from China than China was willing to buy from Britain, and the difference was draining the empire's silver reserves at an alarming rate. The solution that the East India Company devised was opium, grown in Bengal and exported illegally into Chinese ports, where it spread addiction across tens of millions of people, while returning the silver flow in Britain's favor. By 1839, opium sales to China were paying for the entire British tea trade. The Daoguang Emperor appointed the scholar official Lin Zexu to end the trade entirely. Lin arrived in Canton in March 1839, confiscated more than 20,000 chests of opium belonging to British merchants, over 1,400 tons of the drug, and had it destroyed with salt and lime in trenches dug for the purpose. He also wrote an open letter to Queen Victoria appealing to her moral responsibility, citing what he understood to be a strict prohibition on opium within Britain itself. The letter never reached the Queen. What reached China instead was the Royal Navy. The First Opium War, fought from 1839 to 1842, exposed the catastrophic military gap between a Qing dynasty still fighting with weapons from a previous century and a British force equipped with steamships and industrial-age artillery. Chinese officers who could not repel the British attacks committed suicide by the dozens. The Qing capitulated. On August 29, 1842, Chinese officials signed the Treaty of Nanking at gunpoint. The treaty was the first of what China would call the unequal treaties. It demanded a large indemnity, opened 5 treaty ports to British trade, and ceded Hong Kong Island to the British Empire in perpetuity. Lord Palmerston, the British Foreign Secretary, was furious. His representative had exchanged a potentially unlimited commercial foothold in China for what Palmerston dismissed as a barren island with hardly a house upon it. He was more right about what it lacked than about what it would become. The colony that Britain planted on Hong Kong Island in the 1840s was improbable from the start. The island was rocky, malarial, prone to typhoons, and almost entirely lacking in the fresh water and flat land that cities require. Governor Pottinger, the first of what would be 28 colonial governors, set aside the island's northern waterfront for a settlement named Victoria, began surveying and auctioning building lots, and declared Hong Kong a free port, meaning that goods could flow through it without import duties. That single decision, made partly from pragmatism and partly from a colonial ideology favoring open markets, turned out to be the foundation of everything. Merchants from Canton, Bombay, and London arrived to take advantage of a harbor, where the only rule was that trade was free. The Tanka boat people, who had been providing local knowledge and labor to the British since before the formal cession, moved their sampans alongside the new wharves. Cantonese workers came from the mainland to build the roads and the warehouses and the colonial government buildings rising along the waterfront. By the 1860 Convention of Peking, which ended the Second Opium War, China was forced to cede the Kowloon Peninsula, the strip of mainland directly across the harbor from Victoria, to Britain as well, giving the colony its famous skyline configuration. Then, in 1898, with the 99-year lease of the new territories from the Qing government, British Hong Kong acquired its full geographic extent. The islands, the peninsula, and the agricultural hinterland stretching north. The lease was the legal fulcrum on which everything after would eventually turn. It expired at midnight on June 30th, 1997. Everyone from the moment the ink dried in 1898 was aware of the clock. The colony grew through the late 19th and early 20th centuries as a commercial engine, fueled by trade with the Chinese interior, by the labor of people who had no particular reason to trust the British government, but found that Hong Kong's legal framework, its relative order, and its economic openness offered more opportunity than the mainland could. Taiping Rebellion refugees came in the 1850s. Floods and famines sent more. The population, a few thousand at the founding, had reached 1.6 million by 1941, drawn from every province of China and every corner of Britain's trading empire. Through 2 world wars, through the collapse of the Qing dynasty in 1912, and the chaos of the early republic, through the Japanese invasion of the Chinese mainland beginning in 1937, Hong Kong remained British, an anomalous pocket of colonial order at the edge of a continent in upheaval. Refugees arrived in waves. Each wave brought skills, capital, and hunger. Christmas Day, 1941, brought the end of that stability, suddenly and brutally. Japanese forces had invaded the mainland territories of the new territories and Kowloon on December 8th, the same morning as the attack on Pearl Harbor, and 18 days of fierce fighting followed before Governor Mark Young signed the surrender document on Christmas Day. The occupation that followed lasted 3 years and 8 months, a phrase san nin bat yet in Cantonese that became a metonym for the entire experience of those years, the way the duration itself encoded what it had been like to live through it. The Japanese enforced deportation policies that reduced the population from 1.6 million to 600,000. Food was scarce. Civilians were interned at Stanley. Forced labor was common. The harbor that had made Hong Kong valuable became a staging ground for imperial expansion in the opposite direction. When Japan surrendered in August 1945, the British returned, raising the colonial flag again over a city that had been stripped and traumatized. The people who had endured the occupation rebuilt, as they had always rebuilt, without waiting to be asked. What happened in Hong Kong in the decade after 1945 was one of the most dramatic economic transformations in recorded history, and it was accomplished almost entirely by people who arrived carrying nothing. When the Chinese Civil War ended in 1949 with Mao Zedong's communist victory, Hong Kong received one of the largest refugee influxes any city had ever absorbed. Hundreds of thousands of mainland Chinese flooded across the border, many of them sleeping in squatter camps on the hillsides above Kowloon. Among the refugees were Shanghai industrialists, men who had run the cotton spinning mills of the Yangtze Delta and now arrived in Hong Kong with technical knowledge, business networks, and whatever capital they had managed to carry. They found a vast pool of cheap labor living in those hillside settlements. A colonial government that imposed minimal industrial regulation, and a harbor connecting them to the markets of the United States and Europe. The United Nations trade embargo on Communist China, imposed during the Korean War in 1951, severed Hong Kong from its traditional entrepot role as a gateway to the mainland. Stripped of its Chinese hinterland trade, the colony pivoted entirely to manufacturing. Textiles, toys, plastic flowers, wigs, transistor radios, umbrellas, enamelware. The factories of Kuntong and Cheung turned out goods for the consumer markets of the developed world at prices no one else could match. Hong Kong became one of the 4 Asian tigers, its economy growing at rates that made economists reach for new metaphors. Real GDP growth averaged nearly 9% annually through the 1960s and 1970s. A city of squatter camps and floating boat dwellers had become, within a single generation, one of the most productive manufacturing centers on Earth. A fire at Shek Kip Mei squatter settlement on Christmas Day, 1953, destroyed the homes of 58,000 people in a single night. The colonial government's response, constructing permanent public housing estates on a massive scale, eventually housing half the population of Hong Kong, turned catastrophe into social policy. The McLehose era of the 1970s layered compulsory free education, public health care, and an independent commission against corruption on top of the economic achievement, turning a laissez-faire colony into something with a functioning social contract. In 1967, that social contract was tested. The Cultural Revolution was consuming mainland China, and its energies bled across the border into Hong Kong, where left-wing labor organizers and pro-Beijing groups transformed a factory dispute at an artificial flower company into a months-long campaign of strikes, bombings, and street violence. 51 people died. Roadside bombs were planted across the city. The colonial government broadcast Cantonese opera from loudspeakers to drown out communist propaganda. What the riots revealed, and what mattered more than the violence itself, was that the majority of Hong Kong's people, most of them Chinese, most of them with families on the mainland, many of them refugees from communist rule, chose the colonial status quo over the alternative being offered. The 1967 crisis did not produce revolution. It produced reform. And from that reform, over the following 2 decades, emerged something entirely new, a Hong Kong identity, distinct from both Britain and China, shaped by the experience of having built something remarkable in a place that no one had planned to make remarkable. That identity expressed itself in 100 ways. In Cantopop, the Cantonese language popular music that flooded from radio stations and cassette players in the 1970s and 1980s, produced by artists like Teresa Teng and Roman Tam, and later the 4 Heavenly Kings, singing about a city that was simultaneously Chinese and modern, rooted and restless. In the action cinema of Bruce Lee, Jackie Chan, and Chow Yun-fat, which took Hong Kong's own martial arts tradition and turned it into a global visual language. In the Cha Chan Teng, the Hong Kong-style cafes serving milk tea and pineapple buns that were neither British nor Chinese, but something the city had invented for itself, practical and beloved in equal measure. In the neon signs that turned the streets of Mongkok and Causeway Bay into a vertical blaze of red and gold Chinese characters above the English-lettered shopfronts below. This was a culture assembled from whatever was available, and it was entirely its own. The announcement that changed everything came in 1984. Margaret Thatcher had already met Deng Xiaoping in Beijing 2 years earlier, attempting to argue that Britain might retain some administrative role in Hong Kong after the new territory's lease expired in 1997. Deng had been direct. Sovereignty was not negotiable. The Sino-British Joint Declaration, signed on December 19, 1984, committed Britain to return all of Hong Kong to China in 1997. In return, China committed to governing Hong Kong under a principle Deng himself had formulated: one country, two systems. For 50 years after the handover, Hong Kong would maintain its own legal system, its own currency, its own freedoms of speech and assembly and press. Everything except foreign affairs and defense would remain as it was. The 50 years would expire in 2047. A wave of emigration followed the announcement, as Hong Kongers who had the means and the connections left for Canada, Australia, Britain, and the United States. The wave became a flood after June 4th, 1989, when Chinese army tanks crushed the pro-democracy movement in Tiananmen Square. Hong Kongers watched those images on live television. The image of a single man standing before a column of tanks burned itself into the city's collective memory, with a fear that was not abstract. The full 1.5 million people who took to the streets of Hong Kong on May 28, 1989, marching in solidarity with the students in Beijing, were also marching out of terror about their own future. Every year after, until 2020, Hong Kong held a candlelight vigil on June 4th in Victoria Park, the only place on Chinese soil where the Tiananmen massacre was publicly commemorated. At midnight on June 30th, 1997, in the gleaming new Convention and Exhibition Center, built on reclaimed harbor land, the handover ceremony unfolded before the eyes of a watching world. Prince Charles read a prepared speech. Chinese President Jiang Zemin declared that the Chinese people had washed away a century of humiliation. The last governor, Chris Patten, who had spent 5 years as the most popular colonial official Hong Kong had ever had, expanding democratic representation over Beijing's furious objections, sat in the audience watching the British flag come down, reported to be quietly weeping. At precisely midnight, the flag of the People's Republic and the flag of the new Hong Kong Special Administrative Region rose together to the sound of the national anthem. The moment was genuinely historic and genuinely ambiguous in equal measure. 156 years of British colonial rule ended. A 50-year experiment in one country, two systems began. The experiment's early years were turbulent in ways that had nothing to do with politics. The SARS epidemic of 2003 killed 299 people in Hong Kong and brought the city to a terrified standstill for months, emptying the streets and devastating the economy. The recovery that followed was rapid, but the political climate was changing. A proposed national security law in 2003 brought 500,000 people into the streets in protest, the largest demonstration since the handover, and the government shelved the legislation. The umbrella movement of 2014, demanding genuine universal suffrage in the election of Hong Kong's leader, filled the streets of Central and Mong Kok with yellow umbrellas for 79 days. Beijing did not move. The protests ended without concessions. Then came 2019. In February of that year, the Hong Kong government proposed amendments to the extradition law that would allow criminal suspects to be transferred to mainland China for trial. The legal and democratic concerns were immediate and specific. China's judicial system offered none of the independent oversight that Hong Kong's common law courts provided, and the amendment as written applied to everyone, not just to those suspected of conventional crimes. On June 9th, an estimated 1 million people, roughly 1 in 7 residents of the city, marched in opposition. The government pushed ahead. On June 16th, an estimated 2 million people marched, the largest demonstration in Hong Kong's history, filling every approach to the government headquarters. The government eventually withdrew the bill, but the protests had moved beyond it. Demonstrators articulated 5 demands, including genuine democratic elections and an independent investigation into police conduct during the crackdowns. None of the 5 were met. In June 2020, Beijing enacted the national security law directly, bypassing Hong Kong's own legislature entirely, making it a crime punishable by up to life imprisonment to advocate for secession, to undermine state power, to engage in terrorism, or to collude with foreign forces. The law's definitions were broad enough to criminalize much of what had previously been ordinary political speech. Newspapers were raided, Their founders arrested and prosecuted, unions dissolved themselves, rather than be designated subversive. The annual Tiananmen Vigil was banned. More than 10,000 people were arrested in connection with the protests, and nearly 3,000 prosecuted. More than 100,000 people emigrated from Hong Kong in the years after the law's passage, the largest outflow since the uncertainty of the 1980s and 1990s. The city that had spent 50 years quietly building a distinct identity found that identity being systematically dismantled. What Hong Kong has been and what it will become cannot be resolved from outside. The harbor is still there, still deep, still connecting the city to the same sea lanes it has commanded since the Tanka boat people named it. The streets of Mong Kok are still dense with neon and commerce and Cantonese conversation. The Cha-Chan Tangs still serve their milk tea in the morning. The container terminals still process more cargo than almost any port on Earth. The city built by refugees and fishermen and colonial merchants and factory workers and financiers and filmmakers is still, however, battered present, still one of the most densely inhabited, economically complex, and culturally specific places on the planet. Hong Kong has always lived inside other people's decisions about its fate. The Opium Wars, the unequal treaties, the 99-year lease, the Sino-British Declaration, the National Security Law. None of these were made by the people living there. What the people living there made instead, in the gaps between those decisions, was a civilization, layered, practical, proud, and fully aware, with the clear-eyed pragmatism that comes from knowing exactly how provisional every arrangement is, that what they had built was worth the effort it had taken and worth the losses they had sustained to protect it. The harbor is still fragrant. The story is not finished.